I'm getting the nod, so that must mean it's time to go. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to IFAS Day for the event. I'd also like to welcome those of us who are joining online this afternoon. My name is Augusta Featherston, and I'm the chair of IFAS Youth Engagement Working Group, as well as the Regional Program Officer in IFAS Center for Applied Research and Learning. I'm joined on the podium today by Susan Stroud, Executive Director of Innovations and Civic Participation, Karen Scheuer, Youth and Volunteerism Specialist at Peace Corps Office of Overseas Programming and Training Support, and Meg Shanks, MA candidate at Gallaudet University. So, as you know, IFAS work around the world focuses on advancing good governance and democratic rights by providing technical assistance to election officials and empowering citizens to engage in the political process so that the underrepresented can have a voice in the way they are governed. And as such, developing the habits, values, and skills associated with active citizenship is a vitally important component of this work, particularly in light of the fact that in many of the countries where IFAS works, the majority of the population can be considered youth by some measure. And that's whether one defines youth as population under 30, for example, or incorporates more nuanced distinctions that disaggregate into further categories such as childhood, early adolescence, and young adulthood. So IFA's position on youth engagement hinges on the age of enfranchisement as an important milestone, and we seek to create a culture of engagement for young people who are not yet old enough to vote through our democracy camps and other school-based programs. And likewise, for young people that are able to formally participate in the political process, IFAS provides training, tools, and opportunities for new voters to vote and advocate for change within their communities. So, while casting a ballot is an important act in a democratic society, a healthy and stable democracy does require more than just voters. Truly active citizens are knowledgeable about problems and opportunities within their communities, and they're equipped to take on those challenges. And it's particularly important to cultivate these skills in the newest generation of active and engaged citizens. Today's discussion will explore youth service learning as a unique approach to civic education for young people. And this model is designed with the twin objectives of enhancing the learning process for the student, which then instills civic responsibility by providing an avenue for meaningful engagement, as well as to strengthen communities through service. This is relevant to IFAS work, as effective youth service learning programs can help translate classroom theory into practice and ideas into action by allowing students the space to define what it means to participate in and contribute to democratic society, as well as deepen their understanding of leadership, complex problems, and social responsibility in a real-world context. I'm eager to hear from our panelists concerning the impact of youth service learning on communities and young people, and also to hear about some of the best ways to implement youth service learning programming in a domestic and international context. We'll also explore some of the benefits that young people with disabilities in particular derive from service learning programs, as well as some of the unique barriers they encounter. Before we begin, I'd like to encourage our online audience to submit questions throughout the presentation by emailing them to info@ifas.org or by tweeting them to @IFAS1987. There was some discussion whether you should say tweet them to or tweet them at, but I said at. This information is also available on the page on which you're watching this webcast, and we ask that all members of the audience, whether in person or online, state their name and affiliation when asking a question. On that same page, and also on the literature table outside of this room, you'll see we've provided a few documents the panelists may make reference to during their remarks. Each of our panelists will speak for about 10 minutes, then we'll have a question and answer session. I'd like to ask Susan to begin our discussion today by speaking about service learning from a policy-level perspective and by giving us insight from her considerable experience in this field. Susan is the Executive Director of Innovations and Civic Participation, which promotes social development and social change through youth civic engagement. She has more than 30 years of experience in this field, designing programs, developing policies, and building networks that impact youth civic engagement on a large scale in both a domestic U.S. and an international context. Susan?
Thank you, Augusta, and thank you for inviting us to be here today on this topic. As Augusta said, in my current position with Innovations in Civic Participation, we're working both domestically and internationally on the topic of youth civic engagement. So that's the one particular issue that we work on around the world. And we work with a number of different kinds of organizations, universities, community-based organizations, governments. But the thread that connects it all is that all of the work has to do with giving young people the opportunity to make a difference in their community and to learn important skills and values and acquire knowledge about topics that are important to them and important to the community at the same time. So it's all about creating opportunity because we start at the point of believing that young people around the world are eager to make a difference in their community, and what the barrier to engaging more young people in community work that makes a difference is the lack of opportunity, not the lack of interest on the part of young people. So there's on this topic, there's often some confusion or misunderstanding about the differences between volunteering and service learning, community service. These are all related, but they're different in some significant ways. And I think of them as being, in a sense, on a continuum where volunteering is generally motivated by concern and compassion, empathy, and results in people, but we're talking especially about young people, taking some kind of action to alleviate a situation that they are concerned about. So there might be homeless people in their community, and so they take some action to address the problem of homelessness by volunteering in a shelter, for instance. The difference between that and service learning, for those of you who aren't as familiar with this issue, is that in service learning there are some defined educational objectives, learning objectives that are defined in advance of organizing a project. So you want outcomes for the community, and you want learning outcomes for the young person who is actually doing the service. So the difference between serving soup at a soup kitchen, which might be a volunteer activity and laudable, certainly a good thing in and of itself, and a service learning project that has to do with homelessness and hunger would be for the organization that the student is working with or the young person is working with to define some learning objectives that they want to have come out of the service. So a student or a young person might, this can be either done through a community-based organization or a school, but you would identify learning objectives that you wanted the student to have or the young person to have as a result of doing the service. So it might be asking questions that you wouldn't necessarily ask if you were just volunteering. If you were doing a service learning program around homelessness and hunger, you might ask questions about how many people in the community lack sufficient food, and what are the reasons for the lack of sufficient food in the community for some people, and what are the policies that community has for being able to provide enough food for the members of the community. So you're trying to learn from the experience in a way that educates you about an issue in addition to actually providing the service. So although, as I say, we think of these as being along a continuum of volunteering to moving towards a more kind of deliberate and intentional learning experience that includes service. They're related, but they're in some ways quite different as well. And we've seen service learning applied in all kinds of contexts with all kinds of young people, from we're going, for instance, to Cairo this week, where we'll be doing some training of faculty who are from universities around the Arab region about incorporating service learning in their coursework. We've done similar work with young people through community-based organizations and international organizations in Latin America and Asia. So I don't think the context that this is only appropriate for certain kinds of young people. It's appropriate for all young people, and we've seen it work in all different kinds of contexts. I think sometimes people also assume that this is something only privileged young people will do. We take the position that it's not about giving something to people who are less fortunate than you in a kind of one-way exchange, but rather it's about doing something that benefits the community and at the same time benefits yourself, and it applies across the board, I think, to young people from all kinds of backgrounds and circumstances. Are there challenges in the field? I would say there certainly are. One is, I think, as I mentioned before, the lack of opportunity for young people to do this kind of work. I don't think that even though there's been talk in the youth development field for 20 years or so about a paradigm shift that gives young people voice and sees young people as assets and resources in their communities, I think, in fact, when we look at most opportunities that are available for young people, they quite often don't have much voice in determining what those projects are. So I still think it's an opportunity deficit and a question of not taking young people's opinions as seriously as I think we could and should. So those would be two of the main challenges. And then I think there's still this assumption that that all volunteering is good, and all and that it isn't necessarily combined with the opportunity for learning skills, knowledge, and the values that are required for a young person to become an effective citizen or to be an effective citizen. And unless we give young people the opportunity to practice being good citizens, they won't otherwise learn it. You only learn to be a good, effective citizen by being a good, effective citizen. There isn't a way to just learn that from a book or learn that in the classroom. You have to it's something you actually have to practice. And so young people, I think, very much need the opportunity, and our society needs to give them the opportunity to practice those skills and values and exercise their knowledge to be effective citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate that. Sorry for reaching your mic there.
I forgot.
A lot of you said so many things that I hope come up again in our discussion period. But how to reach the most marginalized young people would be one of them. And your comment about they're not just recipients of charity or service or what have you, but have something to contribute in a substantive way to communities. Also, that service learning is appropriate for all young people, I think, is something that this group might have some discussion points to talk about. So again, I'm looking forward to our robust Q&A session. I'd like to continue with Karen, who will provide some remarks focused on her experiences in the field with Peace Corps and Girl Scouts International, and maybe can talk about the value and impact of youth service learning abroad. Please take it away.
Thanks, Augusta, and thanks to IFAS for having us. This is exciting conversation, and it's great to hear Susan, your comments. I couldn't agree with them more. And just to get a sense of the audience, how many of you are familiar with the Peace Corps and how Peace Corps works? Okay, good. Are there any returned Peace Corps volunteers in the audience? I know Carrie is. Okay, great. 4. Wonderful. So just to put it into context of how Peace Corps supports service learning, and then I'll talk a little bit more about service learning specifically. Peace Corps has about 7,500 active volunteers working in 65 countries now. And Peace Corps volunteers across the board, regardless of what sector, whether they're working in health, agriculture, environment, education, youth development, or community economic development, work with youth. So 73% of the beneficiaries that Peace Corps volunteers work with are youth. And service learning is a great way to engage youth and essentially to address that challenge that you talked about of providing opportunities for youth to engage in their communities. Peace Corps volunteers are really dedicated to not only providing opportunities to engage youth, but also trying to motivate youth to tackle some of the pressing issues in their communities and building the capacity of youth to do that through service learning projects and community engagement projects. So I do want to talk a little bit about how I understand service learning and some of the challenges. I think it's really important that it's youth-led, and sometimes adults have a hard time letting go and letting girls. My background is in the Girl Scouts, so I often think about it in the context of girls, but letting youth lead the projects. And so I think that's a really key component. It's also one of the challenges. And then another important consideration for service learning is really working with youth to identify sustainable solutions to problems and examining the issue and really digging down to the root cause of what it is that is troubling their community or their neighborhood or whatever that problem is that they're trying to address. And it's important that youth are identifying those issues. And you talked a little bit about the difference between volunteerism and service learning, and often we think about service projects, going in and cleaning up a park, for example. And so for me, taking it to the next level is a service learning project where the youth are really identifying the issue, doing their research with the community, not for the community and coming up with a solution that they think is right for the community, but doing it in partnership with the community. And then planning some kind of service activity, again, with the community, doing that action project, and then reflecting on it. And that gets to your learning objectives and really thinking about what they learned and what happened, what does that mean, what would they do differently next time, and how did they grow from that experience, and what can they do with that, and then hopefully iterating it too. And a really important component of the service learning experience is also demonstrating what they've learned. So if youth have an opportunity to share the results of their project with others, that's also part of the learning. Not only are they reflecting on the experience, but they're demonstrating to others that they grew from this experience. And it doesn't always have to be a perfect project. And I think that's another really important thing to consider is that so much of the experience and and the lessons learned from that are those learning objectives that you talked about. And hopefully they'll do it again. And as I said, it's an iterative process so that they can incorporate those learnings into that next project and grow from that practice. I love what you said about really it is about learning by doing, and so service learning is part of that. So I talked a little bit about the steps and components, the planning, the research, the partnering with the community, the action, reflection, demonstration, hopefully celebration too. I also wanted to address some of the skills that I think youth derive from participating in service learning projects, and there's a lot of them, but some of the ones that I've seen, especially with my work with girls, is a feeling of empowerment, a feeling of agency, and that I can change, that I have an active voice in my community, and I can do something that's going to make a difference. And then there's lots of soft skills, like being able to communicate your passion and advocate for something, working with people and working with diverse groups of people, problem solving, critical thinking. And then, lots of leadership skills, but also resilience. Sometimes it doesn't work out, and sometimes the project may not achieve the goals that are set forth, or it may not result in the vision that the youth had originally, envisioned. And that's okay, too. And so being okay with that and being flexible and adaptive are really important skills to learn through that whole process. And hopefully they'll go back and do it again. I wanted to give you a couple of examples of how Peace Corps works to promote service learning. As I said, Peace Corps volunteers are really working with youth, but it depends on the context. So, for example, volunteers and education volunteers who may be working in school. Like one, for example, Ashley from Moldova, or who's working in Moldova. She is a teacher during the day, but she organizes a public achievement program after school for youth to identify issues in their community that they want to tackle. So in this case, they wanted to come up with some kind of sports and recreation programs for youth in their community. So the youth in her public achievement club fundraised and for sports equipment, but also to host a weekly movie night so that there would be activities for the youth in the community. So those are examples of the types of projects that youth do. Or Ethiopia, we have volunteers who are environment volunteers, but they're tackling the issues of food security in Ethiopia. And one way that they do that is that they have an eco club after school. And the youth start out by taking walks in their community to kind of map their community and what some of the issues that they want to address are. And then they come up with their own solutions by using the service learning model. And, peer education is another project that a lot of youth come up with, too. So, for example, we have volunteers who are working with youth in Peru who are tackling issues around HIV and AIDS by organizing peer education programs so that the youth are educating their peers about prevention and education and raising awareness. So those are some of the ways that Peace Corps volunteers are involved in this, but it's really about providing opportunities and helping to motivate youth and helping build their capacity to tackle some of the issues and giving them that sense of agency. And I'll just conclude by talking about some of the challenges that I've seen over the years. And I mentioned this earlier, but really letting go and letting youth lead. Clearly, it helps to be a coach and a mentor and a resource and listen and help guide. But it's a delicate balance, and it's really important that the youth are identifying issues and that they are really taking ownership of the projects. So that's one key thing. And then also really challenging youth to come up with sustainable solutions, not just cleaning up the park one day, but really addressing why is there so much litter in that park, for example, or why do we have this persistent problem, and getting to the heart of that and coming up with solutions to address those underlying issues. And finally, the last thing I'll say is that it's okay to fail and learn from those. I guess. It's all a learning experience, right? And I think focusing on that learning component of service learning is really important. And so sometimes youth get really frustrated because things didn't work out as they had originally planned. But using it as a learning opportunity and emphasizing that in the reflection component of the service learning process is important as well. So I look forward to the conversation and discussion about this. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Some of what you touched upon really resonated with me. I was just drawing back to my background in youth programming, working directly with young people, and your point about how effective programs must be youth-led. How does one who works with young people navigate that fine line of coaching, but then letting go when maybe you feel like something should go a different direction. So that's tough.
Yes, it's not always easy.
Nope, definitely not. I'd like to turn to Meg Shanks for her comments now about her personal experiences as a young person recently involved in service learning programs. And Meg joins us from Gallaudet University, where she's pursuing a master's degree in international development. So, Meg, take it away.
Hello, I'm the baby of the group. So I have been doing some service learning in my own educational career. I'm right now currently focusing on a master's degree at Gallaudet University. And I originally started with a pre-law program, but then I completely changed my focus. I worked with Mobility International USA in a partnership with them. And their focus was working with people with disabilities. It was really interesting because I was able to contact people and network with them. I also learned how to really listen and communicate with them, understand their stories, use media and other different approaches to helping build that program and those relationships. I fell in love with my first experience working in a service learning environment. And so once I finished my bachelor's degree, I went to Kenya for 6 months under the Foundation for Sustainable Development, or FSD. I worked with them through a non-governmental organization called EDDO, or Empowerment of Disabled Development Organization. And this was a really intense learning experience. They gave me specific objectives and goals that I had to set and work towards. I worked with a budget. I focused on making sure that I was meeting the needs of the community. And I was also tasked to observe the project and make sure that before they started a month earlier, that we were making sure that project would be successful. So we had to develop processes to make that work. We also had to pay attention to the needs of the community. For example, if someone said they needed this, we needed to make sure that they got that. And I had to focus on the different needs that they had, making sure we had an open discussion, working with their organizations to improve the accessibility for people with disabilities, for the deaf and the other disability communities. Sometimes I might understand one disability community, but maybe not another one. So it's been great. In Kenya, the services for people with disabilities is not great. So a lot of the young people in that community don't have a voice. And so my presence there really helped me and helped the community start to develop these programs and run these programs. I tried to work with the organization to encourage them to improve their processes, and to meet with the government to try to get men and women and youth to attend the conferences so they could meet each other. I wanted them to have a voice. And a few did try. We didn't completely succeed, but we did have a few people start to develop their identities and come to those activities. So I specifically focused with people with disabilities, and I realized that it was a very huge issue. So as people are working with service learning, it helped to build that. And it wasn't just young people, but young people with disabilities added an additional layer of challenge to the process in the service learning. As you probably already aware, 1 in 7 of people in the world have a disability. So giving them opportunities to work with service learning and working with organizations is really important. Right now, the ability for people with disabilities to work in those groups they're disproportionate, and so giving them more opportunities will help them. So when I was working with the organization in Kenya, I focused on their general goals, but as well as people with disabilities. We worked with budgets and creating proposals for people to work with people with disabilities and in the community in general. And it was a horrible experience for them, but it did happen, and we're glad that happened. After I finished that, I worked with USID, USICD. And We worked with World Learning under the United States Council for International Development. That was an awesome experience. I actually just finished that this summer. We focused on inclusion for people with disabilities. I was so excited already and motivated to see their focus on this topic. We were trying to develop concrete ideas and concrete plans and strategies to facilitate people with disabilities. And I needed to sit down and try to understand their needs and what they're looking for. And I personally had my own goals. I wanted to learn skills. I wanted to learn how to present better to an audience. I wanted to make sure that when I communicated with people that my ideas were clear, and that I also was able to learn new software. I wanted to be able to collect research and data and create a database where I put that research into a more easily readable format. And World Learning also had a lot of those same goals for their own organization, and so we really aligned together in that. Personally, as a young person and also as someone who has a disability, I felt like it was a very important experience because through this service learning project that I did, I was able to learn through the organization, and the organization also learned from me working with a person with disabilities. And it gave me an opportunity to work with them and to learn how to include, so they could learn how to include other people besides me who are disabled. There were a lot of challenges. I'd say there's a real lack of awareness. There was a lack of resources. But I did notice that through my experience, there's a lot of, they improved a lot, and people in general, compared to 3 years ago, are more focused on disability. They're hiring more people with disabilities in the community, and they're more aware that inclusion is important, and they're hiring more people in the LGBT community and women, and trying to bridge the gap that has been traditionally held, trying to open the door for new groups of people and new ideas. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Meg. I appreciated your candid talk about some of the challenges that you experienced personally in participating in your service learning projects, and I wonder, are those then were they certainly not unique just to you, and so maybe we can explore ways that some of these challenges can be addressed for other young people with disabilities who are interested in participating in these programs. So with that's the end of the prepared remarks, and now on to the fun part of our time here today. I'd like to open the floor to those of us who are in the room, as well as to our online audience, to ask questions to any of our panelists. So, and just as a reminder, if you're watching online, you can submit questions at any time by emailing them to info@ifas.org or by tweeting them to @ifas1987. And we do ask that all members of the audience state their name and affiliation when asking a question. For those in the room, my colleague will be bringing the microphone to you if you have a question. So with that, let's take it away.
Thank you all. Extremely illuminating. My name is Mindy Reiser. I'm vice president of an NGO called Global Peace Services USA. So we're very interested in service learning. So a question to Susan, and maybe Karen wants to pop in also here. You talked about volunteerism vis-a-vis service learning, and it seems to me a challenge and a calling would be to infuse volunteerism with the broader picture, with objectives. That would require more work from the people organizing volunteers, but I think there would be real interest in that. So I would hope that that divide would gradually cease to exist in any significant way. And my other point, really, is that we have an increasingly large population of senior citizens. The baby boomers are leaving the workplace for remuneration and increasingly volunteering. And so there's an incredible opportunity for collaboration and joint work, but the challenge, again, would be the older folks taking over. But the opportunities are there, and how do you think we can address this really incredible vista before us?
Well, those are both really good points, ma'am. The divide between volunteering and service learning is certainly one that can be bridged. We're just trying to make a distinction, I think, about kind of service-based activities that don't have a kind of intentional learning outcome associated with them. But, of course, just to mention the experience in the States, there's always been, one of the hallmarks, I think, of American society since the very beginning has been a very strong thread of volunteering, from barn raising in rural communities to, response to disasters and so on. So this is a hallmark of American society, American culture for sure. It's not quite so common in some other parts of the world. So volunteering's always been part of our culture. I think the new focus on service learning, or the relatively more recent focus on service learning, is because I think it's seen as having potential for a kind of deeper engagement, a deeper understanding of community issues that benefits both the community and students. Certainly in the education context, I think service learning is now being adopted in schools and universities very commonly now. If you live in Maryland, you probably know that Maryland is the only state in the United States that has a community service or service learning requirement for graduation. But states across the United States have now started to adopt service learning because they see it as a strategy for engaging young people more actively in their learning. So rather than being a kind of passive sort of education that I was more used to as a student, it's a more active learning strategy that is being proven. I think the research is showing that it has some very strong positive results in terms of student achievement. And service learning in the U.S., in the education context at least, is now being, by states and by districts and by teachers, it being closely aligned with the kinds of standards that schools are now expected to establish and achieve. So it's become a more serious educational pedagogy, I think, in recent years, both at the university and the school level. In terms of seniors as a resource, there's the issue of seniors volunteering themselves, and we're an aging society in the United States, as are other countries like Japan, and seniors represent an enormous human resource for addressing many of the issues in the communities in which we live. In the U.S., I don't know if many people here are aware of it, but one of the programs that was established by President Johnson in the War on Poverty was operated by the old Office of Economic Opportunities, called Senior Corps. It's now administered by the Corporation for National Service, which also has responsibility for the AmeriCorps program. And there are about 500,000 seniors in the Senior Corps in the United States every year, which is huge and is in every community across the country. And I think it's the best kept secret in the United States. So there are efforts to engage older people because they are such a resource in terms of experience and wisdom, and they also have a need to be useful. So I think it's an underutilized resource in the U.S., and you're quite right. They can work with children, as one of the programs of the Senior Corps is called Foster Grandparents, and this is a program that engages older people to work in a whole variety of contexts with children and youth. So I think there are many programs like that, but it's still, I think, an underutilized human resource for sure. Thank you.
And just to add briefly to that, AARP has an experience corps, which is a similar concept. I don't know if it's part of the National Service Corps program, but the Peace Corps new chief of staff is actually just came from experience corps, so to bring that insight. And just to add to what Susan said, I think that by engaging youth in service learning programs, that's really establishing a lifetime of active citizenship and engagement. And there is evidence that shows that youth who are involved in service learning programs are more likely to volunteer later in life and more active in their communities. So I think it's really gives them that opportunity. When we look at volunteerism, adults volunteer for all kinds of reasons, and sometimes they need more limited kind of volunteer opportunities and may not have the time to invest in a full-out service learning process. Not that it's not to their benefit, but it just, there's different limitations. Whereas in youth and in education settings or non-formal education settings, there tends to be more time to explore the issues and dig deeper and kind of come up with solutions and build the skills that we're looking for in youth leadership.
Sure. And as a young person, I think that it's really critical to have the older adult perspective. I felt like I can really learn a lot from people like that. If it's a failure or there are mistakes or successes, I want to know that. And I have some experience with some adults who had, taken over, as you mentioned. But I think that if, you encourage an open discussion, that it will be just fine. You just have to make sure that you're including the young people and the old people in the discussion. I remember with the World Learning, one of my supervisors was an older adult, and the two of us really, we talked almost every day, about our goals for the day. If I didn't understand her perspective, she would try to explain it to me. If she didn't understand my perspective, then I would explain it to her. And then we both realized that typically we were on the same page, had the same goal, we just had different approaches. It didn't mean that we couldn't partner together and figure out the best way to do it. And sometimes, working together is way better than working apart.
Thank you. We have a question from the online audience. This is from Laura Boyette. She's at the Center for International Private Enterprise. And her question, she was wondering if the panel could please discuss how service learning can improve democratic participation in institutions in particular. So we recognize that service learning can cover a breadth of topics, but what about democratic institutions, and how can service learning impact these? I don't know who. I could start off with a little bit of an answer here. IFAS works with election commissions and other electoral stakeholders, but we do have youth programs, and we do incorporate some elements of service learning into our programs. And so, for example, one of our flagship youth programs are so-called democracy camps in Kyrgyzstan, and this is a 12-day program where young people come, and it's in the summertime, so it's non-formal, meaning outside of the classroom. But one of the elements that we incorporate into this program is a post-camp project, and so the young people, they come to camp and then leave, and then are compelled to identify an issue that they see in their community, and then design a project to address that issue. Thus, supporting the academic or the curricular goals of the camp, but then also benefiting the community at large. And it's great, and successful projects have an impact, definitely. But then think about what what it means for that young person later. So they've been able to design a project and have an impact, and then that person is much more likely then to engage in the electoral and political process, because then they understand, well, my actions as a citizen matter in this way, and then because I know that, I'm much more willing to engage later on, and that reaps dividends that are difficult to quantify, but that are certainly important. Susan, do you have?
I can think of a lot of service learning programs that have engaged young people in identifying a problem in their community and then figuring out what actions they could take that would lead to the resolution of that problem. So a simple example, children in a school in Argentina that I visited not too long ago were identified bullying as an issue in their school, and but the school board or the governing board of the school had never come up with any kind of policy about bullying in the school. So the children in a particular class decided that what they wanted to do was to survey other students in the school, find out what their experience was with bullying, talk with other students and other members of the community about what possible solutions there might be, and what kinds of policy the school board might enact. And then they wrote that up. They did the research. They wrote it up. They managed to get an op-ed in the local newspaper about it, and they took their set of recommendations to the school board and sat through hearings with the school board until the school board actually came up with a policy about bullying in the schools in that particular school district. So I think that's about as basic as it gets in terms of learning the skills to participate in the political process. And when projects are designed to have those kinds of outcomes, they're often very successful, and then young people are learning how you participate in the political structures that can help bring about change. That's not unusual, I think, in programs.
And it's what you said earlier. You talked about being a good citizen by practicing to be. Well, you don't just learn it; you have to do it.
Right.
Hi, Carrie Bodley-Bond from IFAS. So you've talked a lot about the positive impacts of service learning and also a lot about the challenges. And so what advice can you give to people that might not have a lot of experience designing service learning programs to design projects or integrate service learning into their programs?
I'll tackle that one. I mean, it's several of the things I said. I think it's really important that you emphasize with youth that to do the project with the community and not for the community. Often, youth have lots of great ideas about how to address problems for this particular group without actually talking to the group of people that they want to serve or the community that they're trying to target. So as much as possible, doing it with that community is really important. And that also speaks to the sustainability piece, right? So if you're doing a project in partnership with a particular community that you're trying to serve, then they can help sustain the project, even after the youth leaves the community or goes off to college or whatever, wherever they go. So I think that's really important. And just emphasizing again that although it's challenging, sometimes for adults, giving youth as many opportunities to lead the process and take ownership for it as possible is really important and critical.
And there are lots of resources. So I think if people are interested and not particularly knowledgeable or experienced in using service learning either in community-based organizations, schools, universities, there are lots of resources available. There's a National Service Clearinghouse that has, in the United States, that has a lot of resources, toolkits, guidebooks, examples, and so I think a Google search for service learning resources would
yeah, and I'll hold up in that queue. I'll hold up the Peace Corps resource, which I know that you were involved in developing. It's called the V2 Guide or the Volunteer Action Guide, and it's a really nice tool that is available to everyone online, and I can point you to it, that basically breaks down what a service learning project is. It goes step by step for someone who's facilitating a service learning project with the youth, and then even provides a template to make sure, and a checklist, which I know in the Girl Scout world, volunteers love it when there's a checklist. But of making sure that everything's covered, including prompting reflection questions. And I can't emphasize enough how important that reflection component of the experience is. And so this is just one of many, many resources, but it does do a nice job of breaking the components down, and it can be a tool for anybody who's facilitating service learning. So thanks for mentioning that, because I totally forgot.
There are also a lot of resources related to the government as well. Some organizations, such as educational or cultural exchanges, have a lot of resources as well. So you can also, contact an organization that has experience with, service learning, like the Peace Corps. And I'm sure that they would be happy to share some of the experiences and educational outcomes that they have had.
Yeah, speaking of which, Returned Peace Corps volunteers are a great resource. We have over almost 250,000 Returned Peace Corps volunteers. Peace Corps has been operating since 1961, and if you're looking to engage volunteers in work or to work with youth, looking for your local Returned Peace Corps volunteer group is great. I think Returned Peace Corps volunteers inherently understand the value of service after having served for 2 or more years. And, as I said, there's evidence demonstrating the connection between service learning and volunteerism later, and the same thing for Returned Peace Corps volunteers or AmeriCorps volunteers who have committed to service and then, usually dedicate a lifetime to service, and whether it's after hours or through their work. So if you're looking for those kind of resources, that's another group to tap.
Thank you. I wanted to circle back to something we touched upon briefly during the remarks, and this was the idea of how to reach the most marginalized young people through youth service learning projects, and why would they want to participate in the first place, and how to get them engaged and in a place where they're able to contribute meaningfully in their communities and build their own skills at the same time. So I'll direct this to Susan first.
Well, there are a lot of examples of programs in the United States that I can think of immediately that, and I'm sure if I gave it a minute's thought, I could think of examples from other parts of the world, but where marginalized youth have been, programs have been designed specifically for young people who have perhaps less experience in terms of engaging with community issues in a positive way. And some of the outcomes of those successful programs are that the community begins to see the young people in a different light. It's often the first time, the young people in the programs often report that it's the first time that anybody's ever expected anything from them or asked them to take responsibility for anything. So they begin to see themselves differently and their sense of agency, and the community begins to see them in a more positive light. So there's a program in the United States called Youthled, which many of you may have heard of, which only engages young people who've been unsuccessful at school, been perhaps had some kind of run-in with the law, and those programs. It's an AmeriCorps program. They engage those young people in building homes for low-income people in their communities, and the results of a program like that have been extraordinary. The research has shown just really amazingly positive results in terms of what the young people go on to do, their continued engagement in a positive way in the community in terms of service and volunteering. So, I think there are examples, and when they're well-designed programs, when they're clear outcomes that the programs are designed for, then the effects can be very positive.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said earlier, it really, service learning can give youth a sense of agency, and especially youth who have been marginalized or at risk, a sense that they have something to give and to share is really important, because often they're told that they don't have anything to, and in the Peace Corps context, I think that we look at it, meeting youth where they are, and so often we talk about leadership skills development along with life skills, and life skills being everything from basic effective communication to setting goals for the future and being able to envision a future, and to critical thinking and decision making and things like that. And so leadership and service learning can be a component of that to help build those basic life skills and leadership skills.
And for every community, every marginalized youth, any population that is marginalized, they can be leaders. There are leaders already there. Sometimes you actually have to go into that population and search them out, find out who it is that has that interest. But typically, you can find one or two, maybe three people who are already leading in that population. And when you get them involved, there's a domino effect that happens. You talk with one person, and then there's that ripple effect. And that you will find that you can reach out to those communities and get connected with those communities. With DPO and with disabled people, with the organizations, you reach out to them. They know someone who knows someone who knows someone who knows someone. So you definitely, you can use that approach as well to get into those communities.
We have a question from this gentleman.
Hi, my name is Josh, or you could call me Joshua. I used to work with the Peace Corps in Kenya for 2 years. I worked in deaf education. So I really appreciated all of your comments. I'm not sure if you're aware or not that Peace Corps, the Peace Corps program left, and that was the only deaf education program that they had. So in Kenya now they don't have that program anymore. In Guyana they have that program, but it's not open for volunteers. So I like what you were saying about working with the community to develop solutions rather than just coming up with something and giving it to them. And I was wondering, how would you suggest working with marginalized communities to develop programs if they have so many barriers to even work with you in the first place, to even have a chance to connect with you in the first place because they've been marginalized, so they don't have that access?
Yeah, unfortunately, the Peace Corps recently pulled out of Kenya completely because of the situation there. It's been a rough couple months. I mean, that's a great question. I think it is really about identifying community partners. As you know, having served in the Peace Corps, that the way the Peace Corps works is that first of all, the invitation of the host country government, and typically it's the host country government that identifies the project areas. And so within that partnership, then the projects and the placements are identified. I should mention, I talked a little bit about the sectors in which Peace Corps volunteers work. So there's volunteers in agriculture, education, environment, community economic development, youth development, and health. But there's also, we have cross-sector programming priorities, and volunteerism is one of them. So promoting service learning is a strong component, which is actually part of the original vision of the Peace Corps, established in 1961. But along with that, in the Peace Corps Act in 1961, it was a commitment to working with people with disabilities. And that looks different depending on the context. But several Peace Corps posts or countries have identified working with people with disabilities. So I think it really depends on the local country and the context and what the needs are, articulated at first by the government and then in the local communities, and finding those partnerships, who to work with. And then it also is important that the right volunteers are placed in those sites that have the skills to support the needs of the community and understand those needs. But it sounds like you have a lot of insight that you could lend to us too in that process as well.
So really my question has a lot to do, though, if the government doesn't want to get involved with that, they don't want to focus on, they want to focus on water access or specific goals that they have, but they don't really want to focus on marginalized groups or people with disabilities. How would you work with them if they're not interested in doing those kinds of projects?
Great question. So I guess it's probably a little delicate because it is about intergovernmental relationships, but I believe that we also have a responsibility to educate and raise awareness about issues, right, and to model leadership. And I think we're doing that through volunteerism. Every Peace Corps volunteer is modeling this commitment to service and volunteerism by serving. And so we can also be conveners of conversations around disenfranchised or marginalized populations in those posts, especially where that's an issue. So again, it really depends on who the people are there and if they're willing to have those conversations and if they're informed. But it is incumbent upon us to educate ourselves about the issues that we're tackling in each country or that we're confronted with in each country. And I believe that we can be conveners of those conversations and to hopefully raise awareness. But ultimately, because of the agreements, we need to respond to the needs articulated by the governments because we're a government agency. So it is a little complex. Probably NGOs may have more flexibility in that arena, to be honest. I don't know if that addresses the question.
But I think also in a service learning context, I mean, if there are these issues then that young people identify and then do the research work to develop a project or develop, a mechanism to engage on an issue such as this that's of relevance and importance to them, this is important also, and then circumvents that what you were talking about with the delicate government relations. Yeah, I mean, and there's also an opportunity for inclusion at all levels, right? So in our training, we can engage all of our trainees and volunteers, because every volunteer receives 3 months of training, in-country training, to make them aware of issues around working with people with disabilities and make a concerted effort to be inclusive. So that's a great point. Thank you. I think we have time for one final question. If there's another question either in the room or in the online audience. Question here.
Hi, I'm Johanna Kens. I'm a classmate with Megan Shanks, and I have a question for all of you. You did mention as you're working in those communities there are lots of challenges, and you're trying to work on service learning and include disability inclusion. But is there a particular place that we have found challenges with that particular community? For example, maybe they have certain places they've had a good experience that they would know how to include people with disabilities, and they've overcome some of those challenges. Do you have any opinions about that and how we can improve the quality of life for people with that are marginalized populations, and how that's happened in certain areas?
Well, of course, Joanna knows. we are classmates, so I know that she knows what she's asking about. And where service learning happens is important, because if we have youth that are involved in the project and can advocate, who are in those countries, sometimes they come to the U.S., and like my project required a service learning component. And so how we are able to involve people from other countries, maybe in the democratic or the government process, and then when they go back to their home countries, they're able to contact organizations within their home countries. Right now we're in the process of trying to ratify the CRPD. Some countries have no ideas. They don't have any information about it. They're completely unaware of it, so they don't know what it means. If we had youth here involved in service learning projects focused on the CRPD, then they could go back to those countries and have an impact on the learning that happens. They could, liaise with their government, educate their government about what the CRPD is, and they could engage other organizations in that process.
Thank you. Shameless plug. IFAS is developing an online clearinghouse called electionaccess.org, and it will be a place where information such as CRPD ratification status and election laws and constitutions for countries around the world will be housed, and so it could be a tool to aid in a project focused on that topic area. Well, we've exhausted our time for questions, and I wanted to thank everyone for attending in person and online, and I wanted to sincerely thank all three of our panelists for coming today and sharing their insight. I think it's contributed to meaningful discussion on the value and impact of youth service learning, and certainly the questions and your remarks have generated some ideas for me that I'd like to go and explore later. So with that, thank you very much. The webcast of this event will be posted on ifas.org tomorrow, and I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.